When Professor James Miller entered the forgotten bunker in rural Bavaria, the lights flickered on automatically and 30 teenage students in Hitler Youth uniforms turned to face him in perfect unison. They had been waiting there since 1945, yet none had aged a day. The concrete walls were cold and damp, decorated with faded swastika flags and propaganda posters that should have disintegrated decades ago. The blackboard still displayed German phrases written in pristine chalk, mathematical equations, and detailed instructions for weapons assembly. Desks arranged in perfect rows each held a textbook open to the same exact page. It was as if time had frozen in this underground classroom, preserved like a museum exhibit that no one was meant to find. Miller stood paralyzed at the threshold, unable to process what his eyes were witnessing. As a respected historian specializing in World War II educational systems at Oxford University, he had explored dozens of Nazi bunkers and underground facilities across Europe over his 20-year career. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this impossibility. "Guten Morgen, Herr Professor," the students greeted in perfect unison, their voices echoing off the concrete walls with an unnatural harmonic quality that made the hairs on Miller's neck stand rigid. Their skin was pale but healthy, their uniforms pressed and immaculate, their eyes alert and expectant. They appeared to be breathing, blinking, living beings, not mannequins or elaborate wax figures as Miller had initially hoped. "This is impossible," Miller whispered, his academic mind desperately searching for a rational explanation. His research assistant, Elena Voigt, who had been following close behind, let out a strangled cry before collapsing to her knees on the cold floor. The camera she'd been holding for documentation crashed against the concrete, the lens shattering instantly. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the preserved classroom or the uniformed students. It was the date written in the corner of the blackboard, April 23rd, 2024. Yesterday's date. Not 1945, not the final days of the Third Reich. Yesterday. What Miller and Elena had stumbled upon was known in classified German intelligence documents as Projekt Ewigkeit, Project Eternity, one of the Third Reich's most secretive and disturbing experiments that combined pseudoscientific theories with occult practices. The objective had been to create a generational force of Hitler Youth that would survive even if Germany lost the war, preserved underground until the time was right to emerge. "We have been continuing our studies, Herr Professor," said a blond boy in the front row, his Hitler Youth dagger gleaming at his belt. "We have maintained our routine for 28,973 days. We are ready to serve when called." Miller fought the urge to run. As a historian, his analytical mind demanded answers, even as every instinct screamed danger. He noticed something peculiar about their movements, a slight mechanical quality, as though they were puppets controlled by invisible strings. Yet their eyes tracked his movements with unnerving precision, like predators assessing potential prey. "How is this possible?" Miller asked, his voice barely audible. "How are you all still children?" A girl with braided blonde hair stood up, her movement so fluid it seemed almost inhuman. "Die Zeit ist anders hier," she said. "Time is different here." Elena had recovered enough to stand, though she remained pressed against the wall, as far from the students as possible. "James," she whispered urgently, "we need to leave, now." But Miller couldn't leave. Not yet. This discovery would rewrite history, if he could understand it. "Who maintains this facility?" he asked the students. "Who brings you food, supplies?" The students exchanged glances, a ripple of silent communication passing between them. Then, to Miller's horror, they all smiled simultaneously, identical, empty smiles that never reached their eyes. "We require no sustenance, Herr Professor," said the same blond boy. "We were perfected." It was then that Miller noticed something he had overlooked in his initial shock. The students cast no shadows. Despite the harsh fluorescent lights overhead that should have created sharp shadows beneath them, the floor beneath each student remained evenly lit. Elena had noticed it too. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands, aiming it at the classroom. "James," she said, her voice breaking, "they're not showing up on camera." Miller looked at her screen. The classroom was there. The desks were there, but the 30 students were completely absent from the digital image. He felt his heart pounding against his ribcage as if trying to escape. One of the students, a tall boy with dark hair and glacial blue eyes, approached Miller with mechanical precision. "You should join us, Herr Professor," he said, extending a hand that looked solid but cast no shadow. "Our teacher has been gone for some time. We have much to learn before the awakening." "What awakening?" Miller asked, unable to stop himself. The temperature in the bunker suddenly plummeted. Miller could see his breath forming clouds in front of his face. The lights flickered, and in that millisecond of darkness, the students seemed to shift position, all moving closer to Miller and Elena without taking a single step. "The 1,000-year Reich was not a failed aspiration, Herr Professor," said the dark-haired boy, now inexplicably standing just inches from Miller. It was a precise calculation. Miller took an involuntary step backward, colliding with Elena, who was frozen in terror. "We need to go," he managed to say, grabbing her arm. She didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the students who had begun to move forward in perfect synchronization, their feet making no sound on the concrete floor. With a sudden burst of desperation, Miller pulled Elena toward the door. To his surprise, the students made no move to stop them. Instead, they watched with those empty smiles as the two researchers stumbled backward into the corridor. Miller slammed the heavy metal door shut, his hands shaking so badly he could barely operate the latch. Through the small reinforced glass window in the door, he could see the students still standing in formation, watching them. As the door clicked shut, the lights in the classroom went out, plunging the room into darkness. But even in the darkness, Miller could see 30 pairs of eyes glowing faintly, like distant stars. German authorities were contacted immediately after Miller and Elena managed to escape the bunker. Within hours, a specialized military unit had descended upon the site, along with scientists, historians, and religious advisors. But what they found defied explanation and threatened to unravel decades of historical certainty. The bunker was empty. No students, no Hitler Youth uniforms, no propaganda posters. Just empty concrete walls and dust-covered floors that showed no signs of having been occupied for decades. The military unit was about to declare the site abandoned when one officer noticed something peculiar. A single piece of chalk, completely intact, lying in the center of the room. When analyzed, the chalk turned out to be composed of human bone. The forensic specialist who made this discovery, Dr. Lena Hoffman, vomited immediately upon receiving the results. "It's not just bone," she told her superiors later, her face still ashen. "The calcium has been restructured at a molecular level. It's bone, but it's wrong. Like it's been altered to exist in multiple states simultaneously." 3 days later, at a high-security debriefing in Berlin, Miller recounted his experience to a panel of grim-faced officials from various European intelligence agencies. His hands still shook as he described the students who cast no shadows. "We believe you encountered what the Nazi occultists called Nachkinder, after-children," explained a gray-haired woman who identified herself only as Director Schaefer from a classified division of German intelligence. "This was theorized but never confirmed until your encounter." Miller leaned forward. "What exactly are they?" Director Schaefer hesitated, looking around at her colleagues before continuing. "Based on recovered SS documents, they were an attempt to create what they called temporal anchors, beings that exist partially outside normal time, meant to preserve Nazi ideology regardless of Germany's fate in the war." "But that's scientifically impossible," Elena interjected, her academic training fighting against what she had witnessed with her own eyes. "The Third Reich's final experiments merged technology with occult practices we still don't fully understand," replied Schaefer. "They were attempting to create something beyond human, children who would never age, never die, and never forget their indoctrination." A balding man at the end of the table cleared his throat. The program was called Projekt Ewigkeit in the official documents, he said, but among the SS officers who supervised it, it was known as Die Geisterklasse, the ghost class. Ghosts don't need food, Miller murmured, remembering what the boy had told him. They don't cast shadows. They're not ghosts in the traditional sense, Schaefer corrected. They're something worse, something deliberately created. What made the discovery even more disturbing were the subsequent reports that began flooding in from across Europe. In the 3 weeks following Miller's encounter, 30 different educational institutions reported unusual new transfer students, teenagers with immaculate posture, formal mannerisms, and an uncanny ability to recite historical texts verbatim. All 30 disappeared before authorities could investigate, leaving behind only small pieces of chalk in their empty seats. At Lycée Voltaire in Paris, a mathematics teacher reported that a new student had solved complex equations using methods that hadn't been taught since the 1930s. At Gymnasium Paulus in Munich, a history teacher was horrified when a transfer student gave a perfect recitation of Hitler's Nuremberg speech from memory. In each case, the student in question had vanished by the time authorities arrived to investigate. The most disturbing development came from the laboratory, where the original piece of chalk had been sent for analysis. Dr. Werner Kramer, the chief forensic scientist, was found dead at his desk, his body desiccated as if all moisture had been extracted. Written on the wall in what appeared to be his own blood was a simple phrase: Die Nachtkinder sind erwacht. The after-children have awakened. Medical examiners noted that Dr. Kramer's body contained almost no blood, yet there were no wounds or puncture marks to explain where it had gone. His skin was described as parchment-like and aged beyond natural processes, as if he had been dead for decades rather than hours. Surveillance footage showed nothing entering or leaving the laboratory. The only anomaly was a momentary power fluctuation that caused the cameras to lose feed for precisely 3 seconds at 2:17 in the morning, the exact moment when Dr. Kramer's vitals flatlined, according to his smartwatch data. He was sitting at his desk, examining the chalk under a microscope, explained the security officer who found the body. Then the lights flickered, and when they came back on, he was like that, just drained. Miller couldn't sleep after that. He spent nights poring over recently declassified Nazi documents, searching for mentions of Project Eternity or the Notchkinder. What he found suggested something far worse than anyone had imagined. The project hadn't been limited to a single bunker in Bavaria. There had been 7 facilities across the former Third Reich, in Germany, Poland, Austria, and the Czech Republic. Each was designed to activate under specific conditions, awakening their occupants when the time was right. According to the documents, the project had been overseen by a shadowy figure known only as Der Zeitarchitekt, the Time Architect, a physicist who had allegedly discovered a way to manipulate temporal fields using a combination of advanced technology and ritualistic practices that the documents referred to as wissenschaftlicher Okkultismus. They were trying to create perfect vessels, Miller explained to Elena as they examined the documents together in a secure facility. Children whose bodies would never age, who would retain the pure ideology of the Third Reich, untainted by outside influence. They would wait, suspended in time, until conditions were right for them to emerge and continue the work of the Reich. But how could they survive for 80 years? Elena asked, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Miller pointed to a section of text that had been heavily redacted. According to this, they weren't meant to survive in the traditional sense. They were meant to exist in what they called Zwischenzeit, between time, not fully in our world, not fully outside it. They're not ghosts or supernatural entities in the traditional sense, Miller explained to a secret committee formed to investigate the phenomenon. Based on these documents, they're more like temporal echoes given form through a combination of advanced technology and what the SS called Blutmagie. They used the blood of thousands of concentration camp victims in their experiments. His colleagues looked skeptical, but the evidence was mounting. Similar encounters were being reported across Europe. always involving teenagers in modern clothing who asked unusual questions about current political systems, who displayed encyclopedic knowledge of Nazi ideology, and who vanished when authorities tried to detain them. They're gathering information, Miller concluded, adapting, learning about our world. The pattern became clear when analysts mapped the locations of these encounters. They formed a perfect swastika across the European continent. Then came the broadcasts. Television signals across Europe were briefly interrupted by unexplained static, followed by a few seconds of footage showing empty classrooms with a piece of chalk sitting on each teacher's desk. Most viewers assumed it was an elaborate prank or art installation. Only those involved in the investigation understood the true horror of what they were seeing. The German Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution launched an operation codenamed Kreidit Zeit, Chalk Era, to track and contain these manifestations. Special units equipped with thermal imaging cameras and electromagnetic field detectors were deployed to schools across the continent, but they always arrived too late. By the time they reached a reported location, the Nachkinder had vanished, leaving only faint traces of energy that the detectors registered as temporal disturbances. 5 months after the initial discovery, Miller received an email from an untraceable source. It contained only a video file. When he opened it, he saw Elena, who had disappeared 3 weeks earlier during a research trip to Poland. She sat at a desk in what appeared to be one of the bunker classrooms, her expression blank and her movements stiff. "The lesson has already begun, James," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "The Nachkinder have found their purpose. They walk among you now, learning, adapting, preparing. Their shadows have been cast across time, and soon they will no longer need the chalk." Miller watched in horror as Elena's eyes, once warm and intelligent, stared vacantly into the camera. Her skin had taken on the same waxy pallor as the students in the bunker, and when she moved, there was that same mechanical precision. "Elena," he whispered to the screen, "what have they done to you?" As if hearing him, she tilted her head slightly. "I understand now, James. Time is not linear. It coils around itself like a serpent. What happens now has already happened. What will happen has always been happening. The Reich exists in all times simultaneously. We just needed to find the doors." The video ended with a slow pan across a classroom filled with modern teenagers, normal-looking students who could be found in any high school across Europe. But as the camera moved, Miller noticed with horror that none of them cast shadows, and on the blackboard behind them was a map of Europe with red pins marking the locations of major political institutions. Intelligence agencies attempted to suppress the growing panic as reports flooded in from schools across the continent. Teachers described students reciting passages from banned Nazi texts verbatim. School administrators reported finding classroom doors locked from the inside, only to discover empty rooms with pieces of chalk arranged in perfect swastika patterns when they finally broke through. Parents began keeping their children home, terrified by rumors of strange new students who moved with unnatural precision and spoke with antiquated formality. Some reported that their own children had begun to change, developing perfect posture overnight, speaking with subtle German inflections regardless of their nationality, and drawing elaborate mathematical diagrams they couldn't possibly understand. What terrified Miller most was the theory that emerged from the collected evidence. The Nachkinder weren't simply preserved Nazi youth, they were something else. Temporal templates that could be imposed upon living children, overriding their personalities and memories with those created in Project Eternity. The chalk was the key, composed of human bone mixed with other substances that Nazi documents referred to only as the essence. When a child touched the chalk or breathed its dust, they became vessels for the Nachkinder consciousness. "They're not recruiting," Miller explained to the increasingly desperate Intelligence Committee. "They're converting, transforming our children into what they were meant to be." By the time authorities began screening school supplies, it was already too late. Reports indicated that over 3,000 students across Europe had been affected. showing subtle personality changes, developing German accents regardless of their nationality, and demonstrating unusual synchronicity in their movements. We can't detain 3,000 children based on behavioral changes, protested one official. We need more concrete evidence. By the time we have concrete evidence, Miller warned, it won't be 3,000, it will be 30,000.
Then 300,000. This isn't just spreading, it's accelerating. In Prague, an entire classroom of children was found standing at attention in perfect formation, their eyes vacant, their voices speaking in unison as they recited passages from Mein Kampf. When teachers attempted to intervene, the students became violent, injuring 3 adults before disappearing into the city. They were never found, but 30 new cases of affected children were reported the following day. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the phenomena stopped. The affected students returned to normal with no memory of their behavioral changes. The chalk disappeared from evidence lockers. The bunker in Bavaria collapsed in on itself, buried under tons of earth after an unexplained seismic event. For 3 months, silence. European intelligence agencies cautiously began to stand down their emergency protocols, theorizing that perhaps the temporal anomaly had run its course. Miller knew better.
The pattern matched exactly what he had found in the Nazi documents, a period called Die Stille, the silence, that was meant to precede the final phase, Die Ernte, the harvest. According to the writings of the mysterious Zeit architect, the Nachkinder were designed to operate in 3 distinct phases. The first, Die Erweckung, the awakening, would see them emerge from their temporal stasis. The second, Die Stille, would be a period of apparent withdrawal, during which they would consolidate their influence unseen. And the third, Die Ernte, would be the final implementation of their purpose. They're not retreating, Miller warned Director Schaefer during a private meeting. They're preparing. Schaefer looked tired, the months of crisis having etched deep lines into her face. Preparing for what, Professor Miller? What exactly is their purpose? Miller slid a translated document across the table. According to this, they're meant to be Die Samen der Zukunft, the seeds of the future. They don't need to conquer by force. They just need to teach. On the 1-year anniversary of Miller's discovery of the bunker, he received a handwritten letter with no return address. Inside was a small piece of chalk and a note in Elena's handwriting. Time moves differently for them, James. What you saw was not the beginning, but the middle. The students aren't waiting to emerge into our world. They already have. Look around you. How many of your colleagues cast shadows when the light is directly overhead? The Nachkinder aren't coming. They're already here. Miller's hands trembled as he read Elena's message. He dropped the piece of chalk, which made no sound as it hit the floor. When he looked down, it wasn't there. Yet he could feel its presence, a weight pressing against his mind, whispering ancient ideologies with honeyed voices. That same day, education ministers in 12 European countries announced a revolutionary new curriculum to be implemented immediately, one that emphasized traditional values and historical perspective. The announcements came simultaneously, using identical language, regardless of each country's political leaning. A historian from Copenhagen published a frantic analysis showing that passages in the new curriculum documents matched sentences from educational materials developed in Nazi Germany in 1943. His paper was retracted within hours, and the professor himself disappeared the following day. When colleagues inquired about him, the university administration insisted no such person had ever been employed there. Miller tried to warn anyone who would listen, but his academic reputation was already in tatters after a year of what many colleagues considered delusional claims. When he attempted to publish his findings, he discovered that his university credentials had been revoked. His email accounts were deleted. His passport suddenly showed no record of the research trips to Germany. It was as if James Miller, respected historian and professor, was being erased, not just from institutions, but from history itself. They're not just taking over people, he explained to a skeptical journalist who had agreed to meet him in a crowded cafe. They're rewriting reality around them. The journalist, a young woman named Sophie, took notes with a furrowed brow. But Professor, if what you're saying is true, why haven't these Nachtkinder been caught on camera? Why hasn't someone live-streamed an encounter? Because they exist partially outside our temporal framework, Miller said, leaning forward. Digital technology can't capture them properly, but they're learning to manifest more fully. That's what the chalk is for. It's a conduit, a bridge between their state of existence and ours. Sophie put down her pen. Professor Miller, with all due respect, this sounds impossible, I know. But consider this. How many historical events seem impossible until they happen? How many horrors were dismissed as paranoia until they became reality? The journalist left unconvinced, and the article she published the next day made no mention of their conversation. Instead, it was a profile of a respected historian whose brilliant career had been derailed by mental illness, a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession. Miller's final desperate attempt to gather evidence came when he installed specialized equipment in his apartment. Analog cameras using chemical film rather than digital sensors, electromagnetic field detectors, and ultraviolet lights that he theorized might reveal the Nachtkinder's true nature. For 3 nights, nothing happened. On the 4th night, the equipment detected a massive electromagnetic disturbance at precisely 3:15 in the morning, the exact time that Nazi occult documents described as Die Geisterstunde, the witching hour. The analog cameras captured only blur and distortion, but the audio recorders picked up something chilling, 30 young voices reciting in perfect unison. Wir sind überall, wir sind immer, wir sind ewig. We are everywhere, we are always, we are eternal. The next morning, Miller found all his research gone, physical documents shredded, digital files corrupted, photographic evidence bleached white. In their place was a small piece of chalk and a note that read simply, Kommst du zur Schule, Herr Professor? Are you coming to school, Professor? The final confirmation of his fears came when he visited his former department at Oxford. As he walked through the familiar corridors, he noticed a new classroom that hadn't been there before. A perfectly preserved replica of the Nazi bunker classroom, complete with 30 empty desks arranged in perfect rows. And at the teacher's desk sat a single piece of chalk. Miller knew he should turn around, flee the building, perhaps flee the country, but his feet carried him forward, drawn by an academic curiosity that had guided his entire career. He had spent his life studying the past. Now, the past had come to study him. As he approached, the door swung shut behind him. The lights flickered, and when they stabilized, all 30 desks were occupied by students with impeccable posture and empty smiles. None cast shadows on the floor beneath them. At the blackboard stood Elena, chalk in hand, writing today's date in the corner. She turned to Miller with that same mechanical precision he remembered from the bunker children, her eyes now as empty as theirs. "We've been waiting for you, Herr Professor," she said. "The class is finally complete." Behind her on the blackboard was a map of the world, with red pins expanding well beyond Europe, marking major cities on every continent. Miller noticed with growing horror that next to each pin was a date, all within the next 5 years. "What are these dates?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Elena's smile widened slightly. "Lesson plans, Herr Professor, the timetable for education." Miller looked at the students, their identical empty smiles, their eyes fixed on him with hungry expectation. He had come seeking answers, but now realized he had walked willingly into their web. "I won't help you," he said, his voice finding strength in defiance. "Whatever you're planning, whatever you want from me, I refuse." Elena laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Help us? You misunderstand, James. You already have. Your curiosity, your investigation, your very presence, all have served our purpose." With growing dread, Miller realized the truth. "I was the key. My discovery of the bunker was precisely on schedule," Elena finished, "as was everything that followed. You were chosen, James, not to help us, but to bear witness, to understand what is happening as it unfolds. One of the students stood up, the same dark-haired boy with glacial blue eyes from the bunker. Time is a circle, Herr Professor. What you discovered has always been discovered. What will happen has always happened. Miller felt a chill of recognition. You're him, aren't you? Der Zeitarchitekt? The boy's smile widened. I am many things. I have worn many faces. But yes, that was one of my names once. What do you want? Miller demanded, though he feared he already knew the answer. To teach, the boy replied simply, to correct the errors in history. To ensure the proper future. The other students rose in unison, each picking up a piece of chalk from their desks. They began writing on every surface, the walls, the ceiling, even the floor, covering the room with symbols, equations, and diagrams that hurt Miller's eyes to look at directly. These are the formulas of temporal mechanics, Elena explained, her voice now layered with others, as if multiple people were speaking through her simultaneously. Miller watched in horror as the chalk markings began to glow with an inner light, pulsing in rhythm like a heartbeat. The air in the classroom grew thick, charged with an energy that made his skin tingle painfully. The lesson has already begun, Herr Professor, said the dark-haired boy. Not just here, but in classrooms across the world. The Nachtkinder have always been your teachers, guiding human development from the shadows. But now we step into the light. Miller lunged for the door, but his hand passed through the handle as if it were made of smoke. The classroom around him began to shift, the walls seeming to breathe, contract, expand. Reality itself appeared to be folding, origami-like, into new configurations. You cannot leave the classroom until the lesson is complete, said Elena, her voice echoing strangely. No one can. The most terrifying aspect of this unfolding horror is that it may already be too late to stop it. How many teachers in your child's school cast perfect shadows when they stand in direct light? How many students have developed an unusual interest in German history or display perfect posture that seemed to appear overnight? The Nachtkinder were never meant to conquer through force. They were designed to infiltrate, to educate, to transform one generation before moving to the next. And they have had almost 80 years to perfect their methods. James Miller's final report, smuggled out of Oxford by a janitor who found it scrawled on 30 pages of notebook paper stuffed inside a maintenance closet, contained a warning that authorities have suppressed. The report detailed how the Nachtkinder had spread beyond Europe, establishing footholds in educational systems worldwide. It described a systematic rewriting of history textbooks, subtle changes to curriculum standards, and the strategic placement of teachers who cast no shadows. Most disturbing was Miller's claim that the Nachtkinder weren't simply preserving Nazi ideology, they were implementing something older, something that had used the Third Reich as merely one vessel among many throughout history. They speak of a final lesson, Miller wrote, that will rewrite not just the future, but the past as well. Miller himself vanished without a trace. Oxford University maintains no record of his employment. His published works have disappeared from academic databases. Only those who personally knew him remember his existence, and even those memories are beginning to fade, replaced by vague recollections of someone else who held his position. So I ask you, when did you last check if your child's classroom has a piece of chalk on the teacher's desk? When did you last notice if your child casts a shadow? Perhaps most concerning of all, can you be absolutely certain that what you're reading now wasn't written by someone or something trying to prepare you for the next phase of education? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and hit subscribe if you want to learn more about the hidden Nazi programs that continue to influence our world today. Some secrets were buried for a reason, but others, like the Nachtkinder, were never truly buried at all.